Family, the greatest battlefield you and I will ever face is not out there in the world, it's right here in the mind. Because if the enemy can shape your thinking, he can shape your living. But when God steps in and rewrites your thoughts, everything changes. Too many believers love God with their hearts, but still think like prisoners. We worship on Sunday, but worry on Monday. We quote scripture, yet make decisions based on fear, bitterness, or past pain. Why? Because salvation changes your destination, but transformation changes your mindset. God never intended for you to live with a redeemed soul and a defeated mind. Scripture tells us that we are transformed by the renewing of our minds, not by willpower, not by positive thinking, but by divine truth replacing human distortion. When God rewrites your thoughts, he doesn't just improve your behavior, he redefines your perspective. What once looked like failure now looks like preparation. What once felt like rejection becomes redirection. What once trapped you in fear becomes a platform for faith. But let me be clear, God will not renew a mind that refuses his word. If your thoughts are shaped more by culture than by scripture, more by feelings than by faith, then you'll keep living beneath the level God designed for you. The moment you allow God to rewrite your thoughts, you stop asking, what do I feel? And start asking, what does God say? And when God's truth takes authority in your thinking, peace replaces confusion, discipline replaces chaos, and purpose replaces pressure. So today, the question isn't whether God can rewrite your thoughts. The question is whether you're willing to surrender the pen. Every meaningful battle you will ever fight starts long before it shows up in your behavior. It begins in your thinking. Long before a decision is made with your hands, it has already been approved by your mind. That's why the struggle you feel so intensely isn't always about your circumstances. It's about the interpretations you attach to them. What you believe about what you're facing determines how you respond to it. If your thinking is off, your living will be off, no matter how spiritual you sound or how sincere your intentions are. The enemy understands this better than most believers do. That's why the attack is rarely frontal. It's subtle. A suggestion here, a doubt there, a quiet whisper that says, God won't come through this time, or you failed too many times for this to change. Those thoughts don't arrive announcing themselves as lies. They show up dressed like logic, experience, or realism. But once they take root, they begin to shape your expectations. And eventually your actions follow your expectations. You can't consistently live beyond the level of your thinking. If your mind is trapped in fear, your faith will be limited. If your mind is stuck in the past, your future will always feel out of reach. If your thoughts are governed by insecurity, even God's blessings will feel like pressure instead of provision. That's why the battlefield is the mind, because whoever controls your thinking controls the direction of your life. Many people assume that spiritual maturity is measured by how much scripture you can quote or how active you are in ministry. But true maturity shows up in how you process pressure. When adversity hits, your first thoughts reveal who's really in charge. Do you default to panic or prayer? Do you assume defeat or expect God to move? Those reactions aren't formed in the moment. They're rehearsed in the mind over time. What makes this battle so intense is that thoughts feel personal. We tend to trust them simply because they come from within. But not every thought deserves agreement. Some thoughts need to be challenged, confronted, and replaced. Just because a thought is familiar doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's loud doesn't mean it's right. If you never question your thinking, you'll unknowingly cooperate with ideas that sabotage God's purpose for your life. The mind also acts as a filter. Two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees an obstacle, the other sees an opportunity. One feels abandoned, the other feels refined. The difference isn't the event, it's the mindset interpreting the event. That's why changing circumstances without changing thinking only creates temporary relief. The pattern repeats because the lens never changes. This is why emotional cycles feel so exhausting. You promise yourself you'll respond differently next time, but when the pressure returns, so does the old reaction. That's not a discipline problem. It's a thinking problem. Until the internal narrative changes, the external behavior will always revert. You don't break cycles by trying harder. You break them by thinking differently. The mind is also where identity is either reinforced or distorted. If your thoughts constantly remind you of who you used to be, you'll struggle to walk in who God says you are now. If you think like a victim, you'll live defensively. If you think like someone redeemed, you'll live boldly. Identity-driven thinking determines confidence, endurance, and obedience. What makes this battlefield unavoidable is that you carry it everywhere. You can change locations, relationships, and routines, but you can't escape your own thoughts. That's why running from problems rarely brings peace. The conflict simply relocates because the source was never external. Until the mind is addressed, rest remains temporary. Winning this battle doesn't start with changing what you do. It starts with paying attention to what you allow to live rent-free in your head. The thoughts you entertain eventually become the beliefs you adopt, and the beliefs you adopt become the life you experience. That's why guarding the mind isn't optional. It's essential for spiritual growth, emotional health, and purposeful living. If the battle is happening in your mind, then victory must begin there too. Many people celebrate salvation but grow frustrated with their daily lives because they assume that being saved automatically changes the way they think. It doesn't. Salvation secures your eternal future, but it does not instantly retrain your mental patterns. A person can belong to God and still reason, react, and respond like someone who doesn't fully trust Him. That disconnect is where confusion, inconsistency, and spiritual stagnation begin. There's a difference between being rescued and being renewed. Rescue pulls you out of danger. Renewal reshapes how you function afterward. Salvation removes the penalty of sin. But transformation addresses the power of old habits, old mindsets, and old ways of interpreting life. Without transformation, you end up with a redeemed heart trying to operate through an unrenewed mind, and that tension creates frustration. This explains why some believers love God deeply yet struggle with anxiety, anger, or insecurity. Their faith is real, but their thinking is still influenced by fear, culture, or past experiences more than by truth. They believe God can save them, but they're not fully convinced He can change their patterns. So they pray for relief while still thinking in ways that recreate the very pressure they want God to remove. Spiritual growth is not automatic, it is intentional. Salvation is a gift you receive, but transformation is a process you participate in. You don't drift into a renewed mind. It requires awareness, humility, and consistency. If you never examine how you think, you'll assume that every reaction is justified and every emotional response is reasonable, even when it contradicts what you say you believe. This gap between salvation and transformation often shows up in how people handle stress. They know God is sovereign, yet they still feel the need to control everything. They know God forgives, yet they hold on to shame. They know God provides, yet they live in constant worry. These contradictions aren't a lack of faith. They're evidence of an unrenewed mind trying to coexist with spiritual truth. Many believers confuse activity with maturity. Serving, singing, and studying are valuable, but none of them guarantee transformed thinking. You can be busy in spiritual environments and still carry mental patterns shaped by trauma, pride, or self-reliance. Without intentional renewal, religious routines become a cover for unresolved thinking issues. What makes this especially challenging is that old mindsets feel normal. They've been rehearsed for years, sometimes decades. The brain defaults to what is familiar, even when it's unhealthy. That's why transformation often feels uncomfortable. It requires releasing ways of thinking that once felt safe. Fear may feel familiar. Control may feel responsible. Self-criticism may feel like humility, but familiarity does not equal truth. A renewed mind learns to pause and ask better questions. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? It asks, what is God developing in me? Instead of saying, I can't change, it asks, what does God say about this situation? That shift doesn't happen overnight, but it marks the difference between spiritual frustration and spiritual growth. Without transformation, salvation can be reduced to a future promise instead of a present power. People know where they're going, but they don't experience the freedom available now. They settle for surviving instead of thriving, enduring instead of growing, believing instead of becoming. That's not because God withheld anything, but because the mind was never renewed to receive what was already given. The purpose of transformation is alignment. It brings thoughts, beliefs, and reactions into agreement with spiritual truth. When the mind is renewed, obedience becomes less forced, peace becomes more consistent, and faith becomes more practical. Life doesn't suddenly become easy, but it becomes clearer. Salvation changes your position with God. Transformation changes your experience with God. One secures your relationship, the other shapes your daily walk. Without both, spiritual life feels incomplete, real but restricted. The fullness of faith is not just knowing God has saved you, but learning to think like someone who truly believes it. Real change does not come from good intentions, emotional moments, or positive affirmations. Those things may inspire you temporarily, but they lack the authority to transform your thinking at the root. Lasting renewal requires a standard outside of your feelings, your past, and your personal opinions. That standard is truth, and truth must be introduced consistently if it is going to replace what has shaped your thinking for years. Every mind is being trained by something. If it isn't being shaped by truth, it is shaped by experience, culture, trauma, or fear. The mind does not remain neutral. It absorbs, filters, and forms conclusions based on whatever it is exposed to the most. That's why occasional exposure to truth cannot compete with constant exposure to distortion. Renewal is not about information. It's about saturation. Words have power because they frame reality. The messages you rehearse internally determine how you interpret what happens externally. If your inner dialogue is dominated by doubt, condemnation, or negativity, those patterns will override momentary encouragement. Truth has to be internalized before it can be activated. Until it becomes the dominant voice in your thinking, it will always feel optional instead of authoritative. The challenge is that truth often confronts before it comforts. It exposes faulty reasoning, challenges assumptions, and disrupts familiar thought patterns. That discomfort causes many people to resist it. They prefer thoughts that validate their emotions rather than truth that corrects them. But correction is not rejection. Truth does not shame you for where you are. It invites you to grow beyond it. Renewal requires repetition. Just as harmful thinking develops through repeated exposure, healthy thinking develops the same way. One moment of clarity cannot undo years of internal narratives. Truth must be revisited, spoken, and reflected on regularly. The mind learns through rehearsal. What you repeatedly agree with eventually feels natural, even if it once felt foreign. This is why selective engagement with truth leads to selective transformation. If truth is only consulted in crisis, it will be treated like emergency equipment rather than daily nourishment. Consistent renewal happens when truth is not just read, but meditated on, not just heard, but applied. Information without implementation produces familiarity, not change. Another challenge is that truth must be trusted before it can transform. If you only believe truth when it aligns with your preferences, it becomes a suggestion instead of a foundation. Renewal happens when truth has the final word, even when it contradicts your emotions or challenges your comfort. Authority matters. What you treat as ultimate will shape how you think and live. The mind resists replacement because old patterns feel efficient. They are quick, automatic, and familiar. Truth often requires slowing down, evaluating, and choosing differently. That process can feel exhausting at first, but over time, truth creates new pathways, making healthy responses more natural and destructive ones less automatic. Truth also provides clarity in moments of confusion. When emotions are loud and circumstances are unclear, truth anchors the mind. It doesn't remove complexity, but it provides stability. Instead of reacting impulsively, a truth-trained mind responds intentionally. Instead of assuming the worst, it waits, evaluates, and trusts. Without truth, thinking becomes reactive. Decisions are driven by mood, pressure, or comparison. With truth, thinking becomes anchored. Choices are made based on conviction rather than convenience. That shift does not eliminate struggle, but it changes the source of strength. Renewal is not about memorizing statements, it's about allowing truth to reshape perspective. It teaches the mind to interpret loss differently, to process delay with patience, and to view discipline as development rather than punishment. Over time, truth doesn't just inform your thoughts, it reforms them. The more truth occupies your mind, the less room distortion has to operate. Lies lose influence when they are exposed and replaced. Peace grows where clarity takes root. Confidence increases when thinking aligns with truth rather than fear. When truth becomes the primary influence in your thinking, renewal is no longer an effort, it becomes a lifestyle. Perspective determines interpretation, and interpretation determines response. Two people can stand in the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions, not because the circumstances changed, but because the way they viewed them did. When thinking is renewed, the lens through which life is seen begins to shift. The situation may remain difficult, but its meaning changes, and that change affects everything. Before renewal, challenges often feel personal. Delay feels like denial. Correction feels like rejection. Opposition feels like failure. An unrenewed mind assumes that difficulty means something has gone wrong, either with God or with oneself. That assumption creates discouragement, impatience, and self-doubt. But renewed thinking introduces a different interpretation. Difficulty may be purposeful, shaping character rather than signaling defeat. Renewed perspective doesn't minimize pain, it reframes it. It allows you to acknowledge the weight of a moment without letting it define your worth or determine your future. Instead of asking why adversity exists, renewed thinking asks what can be produced through it. That question moves the focus from survival to development. One of the most noticeable changes in renewed thinking is how the past is viewed. Instead of being a constant source of regret or shame, it becomes a place of instruction. Lessons replace labels. Growth replaces guilt. The past no longer has authority to dictate identity because perspective has shifted from what happened to what was learned. This doesn't erase memory, but it removes its control. The same shift applies to failure. Without renewal, failure feels final. It becomes evidence of inadequacy or confirmation of fear. With renewed thinking, failure becomes feedback. It reveals areas for growth rather than reasons to quit. That shift in perspective fuels resilience instead of resignation. Renewed perspective also changes how success is defined. Instead of measuring life solely by visible results or external approval, success is measured by faithfulness, obedience, and alignment. Progress is no longer dependent on applause. This protects the mind from comparison and the emotional instability that comes with it. Another shift occurs in how people are perceived. Without renewal, interactions are filtered through suspicion, offense, or self-protection. Words are easily misinterpreted and motives are assumed. Renewed thinking introduces patience and grace. It creates space to respond thoughtfully instead of react emotionally. Relationships become less draining because perspective is no longer dominated by fear or insecurity. Renewed perspective also alters expectations. Instead of expecting life to be easy, renewed thinking expects growth. Instead of demanding immediate results, it allows room for process. That shift reduces frustration and increases endurance. Patience becomes possible because the mind understands that development often takes time. This change in perspective affects emotional stability. When thinking is unrenewed, Emotions rise and fall with circumstances. When thinking is renewed, emotions are acknowledged, but not allowed to lead. Perspective provides grounding. It prevents momentary feelings from dictating long-term decisions. Renewed thinking also brings clarity during uncertainty. When outcomes are unclear, an unrenewed mind fills the gap with fear and speculation. A renewed mind resists the urge to assume the worst. It remains open, teachable, and hopeful, even without complete information. That doesn't eliminate questions, but it prevents panic from becoming the dominant response. Perspective also influences courage. When challenges are seen as threats, fear increases. When they are seen as opportunities for growth, courage rises. Renewed thinking doesn't guarantee confidence, but it supports forward movement despite uncertainty. It shifts focus from what could be lost to what could be gained. As perspective changes, gratitude becomes more natural. Attention shifts from what is lacking to what is developing. Even in difficulty, there is awareness of progress, strength, and growth. Gratitude doesn't ignore hardship. It coexists with it, anchored in perspective rather than circumstance. A renewed mind doesn't promise an easy life, but it offers a clearer one. When perspective changes, interpretation follows and responses align accordingly. The same life is lived, but it is experienced differently because thinking has been transformed. Transformation always begins with surrender because UE change requires releasing control. As long as a person insists on managing life through their own understanding, thinking remains limited to personal experience, preferences, and assumptions. Surrender is not weakness. It is recognition that there is a higher authority capable of producing better outcomes than self-reliance ever could. Many people want change results without change ownership. They ask for peace, but refuse to let go of anxious patterns. They ask for direction, but resist guidance that disrupts comfort. This tension reveals the core issue. Surrender is selective. Control is handed over in theory, but retained in practice. As long as thinking remains self-governed, transformation remains partial. Surrender begins in the mind before it shows up in behavior. It starts with admitting that some thoughts are not aligned with truth and no longer serve growth. That admission requires humility. It challenges the belief that familiarity equals correctness. Letting go of familiar thinking can feel like losing security, even when those patterns have caused harm. But transformation cannot occur without release. Control often disguises itself as responsibility. People justify overthinking, worrying, and micromanaging as being careful or prepared. But beneath that behavior is often fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of disappointment, fear of vulnerability. Surrender confronts that fear by choosing trust over control. It doesn't deny responsibility, it reassigns authority. One of the hardest aspects of surrender is allowing thoughts to be corrected. Correction feels personal because thoughts are deeply tied to identity. When beliefs are challenged, it can feel like the self is being challenged. But surrender reframes correction as development rather than criticism. It opens the door to growth without shame. Surrender also requires consistency. It is not a one-time decision, but a repeated posture. Each day presents opportunities to reclaim control or release it again. Thoughts naturally drift back to old patterns, especially under pressure. Renewal requires ongoing submission, choosing again and again to align thinking with truth rather than impulse. Another barrier to surrender is the desire for immediate understanding. Many people want clarity before obedience. They want explanations before trust. But surrender often requires action before full comprehension. It means choosing alignment even when outcomes are uncertain. That choice strengthens faith and weakens dependence on self. Surrender does not eliminate struggle. It changes how struggle is handled. Instead of fighting to maintain control, energy is redirected toward obedience and trust. This reduces internal conflict. The mind becomes less crowded with what-if scenarios and more focused on what is required now. There is also freedom in surrender.